The alarm screamed through the concrete corridors of Firebase Delta, its piercing wail cutting through the humid afternoon air like a blade. Red lights pulsed in violent rhythm along the walls, casting everything in a hellish glow that made shadows dance and twist. The sound bounced off metal doors and reinforced windows, growing louder with each echo until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Smoke billowed from the eastern wing of the compound, thick, black clouds that rolled upward against the pale desert sky. The acrid smell hit first burning fuel, melting plastic, and something else underneath it, all that made veteran soldiers wrinkle their noses and quicken their pace. The heat shimmered in waves across the open courtyard, distorting the view of the damaged building where flames licked hungrily at broken windows. Radio chatter crackled from every direction, voices sharp with urgency overlapping in a chaotic symphony of coordinates, casualty reports, and evacuation orders. The static-filled transmissions painted a picture of confusion, multiple explosions, structural damage, and personnel trapped in sectors that were becoming more dangerous by the minute. Emergency vehicles raced between buildings, their sirens adding to the cacophony while dust clouds kicked up by their tires. Mixed with the growing pall of smoke, the attack had come without warning. One moment the base had been settling into the lazy rhythm of a Thursday afternoon, with off-duty personnel playing cards in the rec room and mechanics working on vehicles in the motor pool. The next moment, mortar were falling like deadly rain, and the fuel depot had erupted in a fireball that shook the ground for miles around. The enemy had calculated their strike perfectly, hitting during shift change when corridors were crowded and escape routes congested. In the command center, officers bent over radio sets and tactical displays, their faces grim as reports streamed. And from across the compound, the main communication array had taken a direct hit, leaving them dependent on backup systems that crackled with interference. Maps spread across metal tables showed the base layout in clinical detail, but the red markers indicating damage and casualties told a story that no amount of planning had prepared them for. The eastern wing housed the computer intelligence unit, a maze of secure rooms filled with sensitive equipment and classified materials. The building's reinforced construction, designed to protect against conventional attacks, had become a trap when the fuel depot explosion sent burning debris cascading onto its roof. Fire had found its way into the ventilation system, and smoke was filling the corridors faster than the emergency systems could clear it. 3 Marines from the intelligence unit had been caught in Sector 7 when the ceiling collapsed, blocking their primary exit route. Their radio calls had been getting weaker with each transmission, static growing heavier as the fire spread through the electronic systems around them. The last confirmed contact placed them in a room near the building's core, where the smoke would be thickest and the structural damage most severe. Outside the burning building, firefighting teams worked with desperate efficiency. Their hoses sent arcing streams of water and foam into the flames, but the fire seemed to grow stronger with each passing minute. The wind had shifted, pushing the smoke directly across the main evacuation routes and forcing rescue teams to approach from more dangerous angles. Every few minutes, another section of roof would collapse with a thunderous crash, sending sparks and burning debris showering down on anyone who ventured too close. The base's fire chief, a grizzled veteran named Murphy who had seen combat in 3 different theaters, stood near the command vehicle with his helmet under one arm and worry lines deep across his forehead. His team had already pulled 7 people from the burning structure, but each rescue had taken precious time and exposed his firefighters to increasing risk. The building's blueprints, spread across the hood of a nearby truck, showed the complexity of the layout, a labyrinth of reinforced corridors and secure rooms that had become a death trap. Medical personnel moved between stretchers, lined up in the shade of the administration building, treating smoke inhalation and burns while keeping one eye on the growing emergency. The base hospital had been evacuated as a precaution when flames threatened the medical wing, forcing doctors and nurses to set up a field treatment area in whatever shelter they could find. IVs hung from makeshift poles, and the steady beep of portable monitors provided a counterpoint to the chaos around them. Security teams had established a perimeter around the affected area, their weapons trained outward in case the attack had been designed to draw defenders into the open. The desert beyond the base walls remained eerily quiet, with only the heat shimmer and scattered scrub brush visible to the horizon. But everyone knew that enemies could be watching, waiting for the perfect moment to strike again when the base's defenses were focused inward on the emergency. The fuel depot continued to burn, sending a pillar of black smoke high into the afternoon sky like a beacon that could be seen for dozens of miles. Secondary explosions punctuated the steady roar of flames as smaller fuel reserves ignited, each blast sending tremors through the ground and rattling windows and buildings across the compound. Fire crews had given up trying to extinguish the depot itself, focusing instead on preventing the flames from spreading to other critical structures. In the motor pool, mechanics worked frantically to move vehicles away from the advancing fire. Humvees and supply trucks roared to life and rumbled toward safer positions, while their drivers kept nervous eyes on the burning building that loomed over them. Fuel trucks received priority evacuation, their drivers well aware that a single spark in the wrong place could trigger another catastrophic explosion. The communications blackout had created its own form of chaos. Cut off from higher command, the base's officers had to make decisions based on incomplete information and their own best judgment. Radio operators worked desperately to re-establish contact with the outside world, their equipment spread across tables in a building far from the main compound. Every few minutes they would raise their heads hopefully, only to shake them in frustration as static filled their headphones. Personnel who weren't directly involved in firefighting or rescue operations had been ordered to shelter in place, but many found excuses to venture outside and watch the drama unfolding across the compound. They gathered in small groups near building entrances, their conversations subdued as they watched smoke pour from windows and listened to the constant stream of emergency radio traffic. Veterans among them shared stories of similar attacks they had witnessed, but even the most experienced admitted they had never seen fire spread so quickly through a fortified structure. The heat had become oppressive, made worse by the massive fire that added its own furnace-like intensity to the already scorching desert afternoon. Sweat poured down faces and soaked through uniforms as personnel worked in the brutal conditions. Water stations had been set up at regular intervals, but keeping hydrated became a constant struggle as the temperature climbed, and the physical demands of the emergency took their toll. Emergency lighting had been activated throughout the base, bathing everything in harsh white illumination that created stark shadows and made the smoke appear even denser. Backup generators hummed continuously, their diesel engines adding another layer of sound to the complex symphony of sirens, radio chatter, and shouted orders. The smell of generator exhaust mixed with smoke and dust to create an atmosphere that burned the lungs and made breathing a conscious effort. As the minutes ticked by, the urgency grew more acute. Every second that passed made the rescue of the trapped Marines more difficult and dangerous. The fire was spreading through the building's infrastructure, weakening support beams and filling corridors with toxic smoke that would overwhelm anyone caught without proper breathing equipment. Time was running out, and everyone on the base knew it. The 3 Marines trapped in Sector 7 had names and faces that were well known throughout the compound. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez had been scheduled to rotate home in just 2 weeks. Corporal Johnson had recently received a letter from his wife announcing their first pregnancy. Private First Class Williams was only 19, fresh from advanced training and eager to prove himself in his first deployment. Their voices over the radio had become increasingly strained as smoke filled their temporary shelter. and their last transmission had been barely audible through the static and interference. Rescue teams had made 3 attempts to reach the trapped Marines, but each effort had been turned back by structural collapses, intense heat, or smoke so thick that even with breathing apparatus, visibility dropped to 0. The building's emergency lighting had failed in most sections, leaving rescue teams to navigate by flashlight through corridors that had become unrecognizable mazes of debris and twisted metal. Each attempt had brought them closer to the trapped men, but also closer to their own limits of endurance and safety. The weight of command pressed heavily on Colonel Peterson, the base commander whose decisions would determine whether the 3 Marines made it home alive. He stood near the command vehicle, his uniform already stained with sweat and dust, listening to reports that grew more grim with each update. The structural engineers had given him their assessment. The building could suffer complete collapse at any moment, and sending more people inside would likely result in additional casualties rather than successful rescues. Yet abandoning the trapped Marines was not an option that any officer could accept. The military code demanded that no one be left behind, regardless of the risks involved. Peterson weighed the lives of the 3 trapped men against the lives of potential rescuers, knowing that either choice would haunt him for the rest of his career. The radio crackled again with another weak transmission from Sector 7, the voices of the Marines barely audible through the static and smoke that was slowly overwhelming their position. The fire had created its own weather system, with convection currents sending sparks and burning debris swirling through the air in unpredictable patterns. Hot winds carried the smell of destruction across the entire compound, while temperature differences created sudden gusts that could knock a person off balance or send flames racing in unexpected directions. Firefighters adjusted their tactics, constantly trying to anticipate how the fire would behave as conditions changed around them. As the afternoon wore on and the emergency stretched into its second hour, the true scope of the crisis became clear. This was not just a fire to be extinguished or damage to be repaired. It was a test of everything the Marines had trained for, a crucible that would reveal who had the courage and skill to rise above the chaos when lives hung in the balance. Private Sarah Chun moved through the chaos like water flowing around stones, her compact frame weaving between emergency personnel and equipment with an efficiency that drew no attention. At barely 5 feet 2 inches tall and weighing perhaps 120 pounds soaking wet, she seemed almost childlike among the towering Marines who rushed past her carrying heavy gear and shouting orders. Her uniform hung loose on her slight frame, the standard issue clothing designed for much larger bodies, making her appear even smaller than her actual size, while others ran with urgent purpose toward the burning building or away from potential danger. Sarah maintained a steady, measured pace that spoke of someone who had learned to conserve energy for when it truly mattered. Her boots, polished to regulation standard, but showing the scuff marks of actual work rather than parade ground duty, made almost no sound against the concrete as she navigated through the increasingly crowded emergency staging area. She carried a standard field pack that looked oversized on her diminutive frame, its weight distributed with the careful precision of someone who had learned to make every ounce count. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Her face bore the smooth features of youth, unmarked by the deep lines that combat veterans wore like badges of honor. At 23, she could easily have passed for a high school student, if not for the serious expression in her dark eyes, and the way she observed everything around her with the focused attention of someone trained to notice details others missed. Her black hair was pulled back in the regulation style, secured with precision that suggested military. Discipline had become second nature rather than conscious effort. The emergency staging area buzzed with activity as senior personnel coordinated rescue efforts and support teams prepared specialized equipment. Heavy-duty breathing apparatus hung from mobile racks, while thermal imaging cameras were tested and calibrated for the dangerous work ahead. Tables covered with blueprints and tactical maps served as command posts where officers traced potential routes through the burning building and calculated the risks of each approach. The controlled chaos of a military emergency response was in full swing, with every piece of equipment and every person assigned a specific role in the larger operation. Sarah paused at the edge of this organized activity, her presence unremarked by the firefighters checking their gear and the medical personnel preparing treatment stations. A group of Marines from the base security detail stood near one of the equipment trailers, their conversation carrying clearly in the desert air as they discussed the rescue attempts that had already failed. Their voices held the mixture of frustration and professional concern that came when training met the harsh reality of an emergency that refused to follow standard procedures. "Third attempt came back 20 minutes ago," said Sergeant Martinez, a stocky man whose uniform bore the sweat stains of someone who had been working in the heat all afternoon. "Couldn't get past the collapsed section near the main corridor. Engineering says the whole floor might come down if we put much more weight on it." He gestured toward the burning building with a gloved hand, his expression grim as he watched smoke pour from shattered windows. Corporal Davis, tall and lean, with the pale complexion of someone who spent most of his time indoors with computer systems, shook his head in frustration. "Rodriguez, Johnson, and Williams are good Marines. They don't deserve to be left in there because some desk jockey calculated the risks wrong." His voice carried the edge that came when professional duty conflicted with personal loyalty, when the mathematics of acceptable losses ran up against the military principle that no one gets left behind. "It's not about calculations," replied Staff Sergeant Thompson, whose scarred hands spoke of years spent handling dangerous situations. "It's about physics. That building is coming apart piece by piece, and sending more people inside just means more people to dig out of the rubble." His tone was matter of fact, but his eyes remained fixed on the burning structure as if willing it to remain standing long enough for a miracle to occur. A fourth Marine, Private Miller, shifted uncomfortably as he listened to the exchange. Fresh from advanced training and assigned to communications duty, he had never experienced an emergency of this magnitude. "What about going through the maintenance tunnels? The blueprints show service corridors that might still be accessible." His suggestion was offered tentatively, aware that more experienced personnel had likely already considered and rejected every conventional option. Thompson's laugh held no humor. "Those tunnels are filled with smoke and probably flooded with firefighting foam by now. Besides, they're too narrow for anyone carrying breathing gear and rescue equipment. You'd need someone small enough to." His voice trailed off as his gaze fell on Sarah, who had been listening to their conversation. From a respectful distance, the four Marines followed Thompson's gaze, taking in Sarah's slight frame and youthful appearance. Martinez was the first to speak, his tone carrying the patronizing note that Sarah had learned to expect from larger, more experienced personnel. "Private Chun, right? You're assigned to logistics support." It was more statement than question, the kind of assumption that placed her firmly in the category of rear echelon personnel who handled supplies rather than participated in actual operations. "Communications and supply coordination," Sarah replied quietly, her voice steady despite the dismissive look she was receiving. She had learned long ago that correcting people about her actual responsibilities was often futile, as they tended to see what they expected rather than what was actually in front of them. Her official assignment covered a broader range of duties than most people realized, but few bothered to read beyond the first line of her personnel file. Davis glanced at her field pack and standard equipment with barely concealed amusement. "You might want to get back to the supply depot. Chun, this is getting pretty serious out here, and we wouldn't want anyone to get hurt." His tone was kind but condescending, the way someone might speak to a child who had wandered into an adult conversation. The implication was clear: this was work for real Marines, not for someone who looked like she belonged in a high school. Classroom. The supply depot was evacuated an hour ago, Sarah replied, her voice remaining level despite the casual dismissal. I've been reassigned to emergency support wherever needed. She didn't mention that her emergency support training included certifications that none of the 4 Marines possessed, or that her small size had made her valuable for tasks that larger personnel couldn't accomplish. Experience had taught her that such information was rarely believed until demonstrated. Miller looked her up and down with the frank assessment of someone trying to determine if she could carry her own weight in a crisis. Emergency support means staying out of the way and helping with the easy stuff. Chun, the rescue teams need people who can haul equipment and move fast under pressure. His words carried the unintentional cruelty of youth, the assumption that physical size directly correlated with capability and courage. The conversation was interrupted by a burst of radio chatter from the command vehicle, where Colonel Peterson was receiving another update from the trapped Marines. The transmission was weaker than before, filled with static and the sound of coughing as smoke continued to fill their temporary shelter. Sarah could make out fragments of the conversation, something about rising temperatures and difficulty breathing before the signal degraded into unintelligible noise. Time's running out, Thompson said grimly, his earlier amusement at Sarah's presence forgotten in the face of the deteriorating situation. If we don't get to them soon, it won't matter how many rescue teams we send in. He turned away from the group, his attention drawn to a commotion near the equipment trailers where firefighters were arguing about the feasibility of another rescue attempt. The 4 Marines moved toward the activity, their conversation shifting to technical discussions about building layout and structural integrity. Sarah remained where she was, her dark eyes studying the burning building with an intensity that went unnoticed by the departing men. While they saw an impossible obstacle, she was calculating angles and distances, mapping potential routes through spaces that others had dismissed as impassable. Near the medical station, a different kind of drama was unfolding as Dr. Patricia Huang worked to treat the Marines who had been pulled from earlier rescue attempts. Her small field hospital was organized with military precision, but the improvised nature of the setup was evident in the way equipment was secured with whatever materials were available. The doctor herself was a study in controlled urgency, her movements efficient but never hurried as she moved between patients and monitored their condition. Severe smoke inhalation on this one, she called to her assistant, a Navy corpsman named Bennett, who had been reassigned from the main medical facility when the evacuation order came through. Get him on oxygen and watch his respiratory rate. I don't want any of these heroes trying to go back in there before they're cleared. Her voice carried the authority of someone who had learned to give orders to people who outranked her, medical necessity overriding military hierarchy. Sarah approached the medical station with the same quiet efficiency that marked all her movements. Unlike the emergency personnel who announced their presence with loud voices and urgent gestures, she simply appeared at Dr. Wang's side when the doctor reached for a piece of equipment that was slightly out of reach. The oxygen monitor was placed in the doctor's hand before she had to ask for it, the assistance so seamless that it seemed almost accidental. Thank you, Private ... Dr. Wang paused, realizing she didn't know Sarah's name despite the helpful intervention. Chun, Sarah supplied, already moving to organize supplies that had been scattered during the earlier rush to treat incoming patients. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, sorting medication and equipment into logical groupings that would make the doctor's work easier without disrupting the established systems. Are you assigned to medical support, Chun? The doctor continued her work while speaking, her attention divided between her patient and the surprisingly competent assistant who had appeared at her side. Cross-trained, Sarah replied simply, her answer technically accurate while avoiding the longer explanation. That would have revealed the full scope of her emergency certifications. She had learned that people were more comfortable with simple answers that fit their expectations, then with complex truths that challenged their assumptions about what a small, young-looking woman could be trained to do. Dr. Huang glanced at Sarah's efficient organization of the medical supplies and nodded approvingly. "Well, cross-trained or not, you're welcome to stay if you can be useful without getting in the way." It was a grudging acceptance, the kind of provisional approval that Sarah had learned to appreciate, even when it came with conditions and qualifications. The work at the medical station provided Sarah with a clear view of the rescue operations, while keeping her occupied with tasks that no one questioned her ability to perform. She watched as teams of firefighters suited up in heavy protective gear, their movements made clumsy by the breathing apparatus and heat-resistant clothing necessary for work in the burning building. The equipment they carried was designed for large, strong individuals, and even the most physically fit among them struggled with the weight and bulk of the specialized gear. A new team was preparing for another rescue attempt. Their leader, Captain Morrison, whose reputation for aggressive tactics was well known throughout the base. He stood near the equipment trailer, his tall frame made even more imposing by the full firefighting gear he wore. His voice carried clearly as he briefed his team on their planned approach, his words punctuated by gestures toward the building schematic spread across the hood of a nearby vehicle. "We'll enter through the south stairwell and work our way towards Sector 7. Morrison explained, his finger tracing a route on the blueprint. "The structural engineers say the floor should hold our weight if we stay close to the load-bearing walls. Thermal imaging shows the corridors are still relatively clear in this section, so we should have decent visibility until we reach the damaged area." His team consisted of 4 experienced firefighters, each one selected for their proven ability to work under extreme conditions. They checked their equipment with practiced efficiency, testing communication systems and ensuring that their breathing apparatus was functioning properly. The weight of their gear was substantial: breathing tanks, communication equipment, thermal imaging devices, and the tools necessary for cutting through debris or breaking down doors. Sarah continued her work at the medical station while keeping one ear on Morrison's briefing. The plan was logical and well conceived, based on the best available information about the building's condition. But she could see the flaws that the planners had missed or chosen to accept as unavoidable risks. The route they had chosen would take them through areas where the floor damage was worst, and their heavy equipment would place maximum stress on already weakened support structures. Estimated time to reach the trapped personnel is 25 minutes. Morrison continued, his voice confident despite the challenges they would face. "We'll have enough air for 40 minutes of operation, giving us a safety margin for extraction and evacuation." The mathematics were sound, but they assumed that conditions inside the building would remain stable and that no unforeseen obstacles would delay their progress. Dr. Huang finished treating her current patient and moved to the next stretcher, where a firefighter was recovering from his earlier rescue attempt. Sarah followed, anticipating the doctor's needs and providing assistance before being asked. The teamwork that developed between them was natural and efficient, born of shared competence rather than formal assignment or lengthy training together. "How are you feeling, Firefighter Jackson?" Dr. Huang asked as she checked the man's pulse and examined his eyes for signs of smoke exposure. Jackson was a veteran of numerous emergency responses, his weathered face and scarred hands testament to years of dangerous work in impossible conditions. "Better than I was an hour ago, Doc," Jackson replied, his voice still hoarse from smoke inhalation. "But I've got to tell you, it's hell in there. The heat is incredible, and the smoke is so thick you can't see your hand in front of your face. We were using thermal imaging to navigate, but even that gets confused when everything around you is burning." Dr. Huang made notes on Jackson's chart while Sarah quietly checked his oxygen levels and blood pressure. The readings were better than they had been earlier, but still showed the effects of prolonged exposure to toxic smoke and extreme heat. Jackson would recover, but it would be days before he was cleared for anything more strenuous than light duty. "What about the structural damage?" Sarah asked quietly, her question directed to Jackson, but spoken softly enough that it wouldn't interrupt the doctor's examination. It was the kind of technical question that medical personnel might ask, seeking information that could affect the treatment of future patients. Jackson looked at her with surprise, perhaps not expecting such a specific question from someone who appeared to be a medical assistant. "Worse than the engineers think," he said after a moment's consideration. "The floor is sagging in places, and you can hear metal groaning under the weight of our gear. I wouldn't want to put too many people in there at once, especially carrying heavy equipment." The information confirmed Sarah's own assessment of the situation, adding the perspective of someone who had actually experienced conditions inside the burning building. She filed the knowledge away while continuing to assist Dr. Huang, her movements efficient and unobtrusive as she worked to support the medical efforts. Morrison's team was almost ready to begin their rescue attempt, their final equipment checks nearly complete. Sarah watched them prepare while maintaining her focus on the medical work, her mind calculating the risks they would face and the likelihood of success given the information Jackson had provided. The mathematics were not encouraging, but she kept her assessment to herself as she continued to work in the shadows of the emergency response, unseen and underestimated by those around her. The sound of Morrison's team entering the burning building brought back memories that Sarah had learned to keep buried during daylight hours. As their heavy boots disappeared into the smoke-filled doorway, she found herself transported back to a different emergency, in a different place where everything she thought she knew about herself had been forged in flames and tested by circumstances that no training manual could have prepared her for. 7 years earlier, when Sarah was still Sarah Nakamura and 16 years old, she had been nothing more than the smallest kid in her high school class in Oakland, California. Her adoptive parents, both professors at UC Berkeley, had raised her with the quiet expectation that she would follow an academic path like theirs. Mathematics came easily to her, as did the kind of systematic thinking that solved complex problems through careful analysis rather than brute force. She was the girl who finished calculus homework during lunch break and spent weekends reading engineering textbooks for fun. The Nakamura household was one of order and intellectual pursuit, where dinner conversations revolved around research papers and philosophical debates. Sarah's adoptive father, Dr. James Nakamura, taught structural engineering, while her adoptive mother, Dr. Elena Nakamura, specialized in emergency management systems. They had provided Sarah with every advantage their academic careers could offer, from advanced placement courses to summer programs at prestigious universities. Their love was genuine, but expressed through opportunities rather than emotional displays. What they hadn't provided was any understanding of the restlessness that drove Sarah to seek challenges beyond the classroom. While her classmates spent their free time at shopping malls or teenage parties, Sarah found herself drawn to the local volunteer fire department, where her mother had once conducted research on emergency response protocols. She began hanging around the station after school, initially just observing, but gradually making herself useful in small ways that no one seemed to mind. Fire Chief Robert Murphy, no relation to the Murphy at Firebase Delta, had been a 30-year veteran of urban firefighting when he first noticed the quiet teenager who seemed to appear whenever there was equipment to be cleaned or supplies to be organized. Unlike the other volunteers who came and went with the seasons, Sarah showed up consistently, asking thoughtful questions about procedures and equipment, rather than seeking excitement or adventure. Her small size made her useless for the heavy lifting that dominated much of the work, but she compensated with an attention to detail that impressed even veteran firefighters. "You've got the mind for this work," Chief Murphy told her one afternoon as she organized medical supplies with systematic precision. "Most people see firefighting as all about strength and courage, but the real skill is in thinking 3 steps ahead and staying calm when everything around you is falling apart." His words carried the weight of experience, spoken by someone who had seen too many promising firefighters wash out because they confused bravery with recklessness. Sarah's first real test came during a warehouse fire that started as a routine call but escalated into something far more dangerous. A homeless encampment in building's lower level had gone undetected during the initial assessment, and by the time firefighters realized people were trapped inside, the main stairwells had become impassable. The building's layout was a maze of narrow passages and improvised partitions that had been added over decades of changing use, creating a puzzle that defeated conventional rescue approaches. She had been working the supply truck when the call came for additional breathing apparatus. Her official role limited to equipment management and communication support. But as she watched firefighters struggle with gear that was too bulky for the building's cramped passages, Sarah saw what the incident commanders had missed. The warehouse's original blueprint, spread across the command vehicle's hood, showed a series of maintenance crawlways that ran beneath the main floor spaces, designed for repair access that would be invisible to anyone who hadn't studied the building's structural details. "Chief Murphy," she had said quietly, approaching the command post where seasoned officers debated increasingly desperate rescue options. "The maintenance level. The blueprints show access tunnels that should still be clear." Her voice barely carried over the noise of pumps and generators, but Murphy heard the certainty in her tone and looked where she was pointing. The crawlways were barely 3 feet high in most places, designed for workers to reach plumbing and electrical systems, rather than for human passage. Most of the firefighters were too large to navigate the tight spaces, especially while wearing the breathing apparatus necessary for working in a smoke-filled environment. But Sarah was small enough to fit, and her volunteer training had included the same safety certifications that the full-time personnel carried. "Absolutely not," Murphy had said immediately, his protective instincts overriding the tactical possibilities that Sarah's suggestion represented. "You're 16 years old and a volunteer. I'm not sending a kid into a burning building, no matter how good your idea is." His tone was final, the voice of authority that had commanded respect in dangerous situations for 3 decades. But the homeless camp held 12 people, including 3 children under the age of 10, and conventional rescue approaches had already been tried and failed. As the debate continued among the incident commanders, precious minutes ticked away while smoke continued to fill the spaces where victims waited for help that might never come. Sarah listened to the radio chatter describing rising temperatures and decreasing visibility, painting a picture of time running out for people whose only crime had been seeking shelter in an abandoned building. She made her decision with the same systematic thinking that had always guided her approach to complex problems. The maintenance tunnels were separate from the main structure's ventilation system, meaning they would remain relatively clear of smoke as long as the fire didn't spread to the building's foundation. Her small size was an advantage rather than a limitation in the confined spaces, and her technical knowledge of building systems gave her navigational tools that others lacked. Most importantly, she was the only person available who could physically make the journey while carrying the communication equipment necessary to guide larger rescuers to the trapped victims. The entry point to the maintenance level was a service hatch near the building's rear loading dock, hidden beneath debris and forgotten by everyone except whoever had drafted the original blueprints. Sarah found it by following the structural logic that her father had taught her during countless dinner table discussions about engineering principles. While the incident commanders argued about acceptable risk levels and liability concerns, she slipped away from the command post and made her way to the service area with a breathing apparatus borrowed from the equipment truck. The maintenance tunnels were a different world, dark and cramped but mercifully free of the smoke that was choking the main building above. Sarah's flashlight beam revealed a network of pipes and conduits that formed a mechanical highway beneath the warehouse floor. with just enough space for someone her size to crawl forward while dragging essential equipment behind her. She had memorized the building layout during the briefing, translating the two-dimensional blueprint into a three-dimensional map that guided her progress through the underground maze. Navigation became a matter of counting pipe joints and following electrical conduits, using the building's infrastructure as a compass in the darkness. Her radio crackled with updates from the command post, where Murphy had discovered her absence and was alternating between furious demands for her immediate return and grudging admiration for the progress reports she transmitted as she worked her way toward the trapped victims. The communications equipment she carried allowed her to relay precise location information to the rescue teams above, guiding them through the smoke-filled main floor to positions where they could receive the people she was directing to safety. Homeless Camp had organized itself around a makeshift family structure, with older residents looking after children and everyone sharing whatever resources they had managed to salvage. Sarah found them huddled in a space that had once been a maintenance office, their improvised shelter now threatened by smoke seeping through gaps in the floor above. Fear had given way to resignation as they waited for help that seemed increasingly unlikely to arrive in time. "I'm Sarah," she announced as she emerged from the maintenance tunnel into their temporary refuge, her small size and youthful appearance making her seem more like a lost child than a rescuer. "I'm here to get you out." The simple statement carried more confidence than her 16 years should have allowed. But emergency situations had a way of stripping away everything except essential competence. The evacuation became an exercise in logistics and psychology, managing 12 frightened people through spaces designed for building maintenance rather than human passage. Sarah's size allowed her to scout ahead and identify obstacles while her calm demeanor helped maintain order among people who had every reason to panic. She guided them through the maintenance tunnels in groups small enough to avoid bottlenecks, coordinating with the rescue teams above to ensure that help was waiting when each group emerged into the main building. The children were the most challenging to evacuate, their fear making them reluctant to follow a stranger through dark, confined spaces that seemed more dangerous than the smoke-filled shelter they were leaving behind. Sarah found herself drawing on patience and reassurance techniques she had never formally learned, speaking to each child individually and making the journey seem like an adventure rather than a life-threatening emergency. Her own youth became an asset, allowing her to communicate with the children in ways that adult firefighters might not have managed. The last person she guided to safety was Marcus Webb, a veteran whose mental health struggles had led him to the homeless encampment, but whose military training made him valuable in coordinating the evacuation. As they crawled through the final section of the maintenance tunnel, he spoke quietly about what he had witnessed during Sarah's rescue operation. "You've got something special, kid," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had seen real courage under fire. "Most people your age would have been crying or throwing up by now. You just kept working on the problem until you solved it." The aftermath of the warehouse fire had been complicated for Sarah in ways she hadn't anticipated. Her unauthorized entry into the burning building created legal and procedural headaches for the fire department, while her successful rescue of 12 people made her a local hero in news coverage that embarrassed the adults who had failed to act on her suggestion. Chief Murphy found himself defending both his department's procedures and his volunteers' initiative, walking a political tightrope that required diplomatic skills he hadn't needed to develop during his years of fighting fires. For Sarah, the experience had been transformative in ways that went beyond external recognition. She had discovered capabilities within herself that no classroom or textbook could have revealed, finding that her analytical mind worked even better under extreme pressure than it did in academic settings. The physical challenges of the rescue had been manageable because they were balanced by intellectual puzzles that engaged her problem-solving abilities. Most importantly, she had learned that her small size was not a limitation to be overcome, but a tool to be employed strategically. The warehouse rescue led to formal, emergency responder training during her senior year of high school, with Chief Murphy serving as both mentor and advocate for her continued involvement in firefighting operations. Her parents supported her new interest with the same systematic approach they brought to academic pursuits, ensuring she received the best possible training while maintaining the academic standards that would keep her college options open. The combination of engineering knowledge from her father and emergency management expertise from her mother gave her a theoretical foundation that complemented her growing practical experience. College at MIT had provided new challenges and opportunities, with Sarah majoring in mechanical engineering while maintaining her emergency responder certifications through the Cambridge Fire Department. Her small size continued to be an asset in specialized rescue situations, particularly those involving confined spaces or unusual access requirements. She earned recognition for innovations in rescue equipment design, creating tools and techniques that maximized the capabilities of smaller personnel rather than assuming that bigger was always better. The decision to join the military after graduation had been influenced by Marcus Webb, the homeless veteran she had rescued during the warehouse fire. He had maintained contact with her throughout college, sharing stories of his own military service and the sense of purpose that came from using specialized skills in service of something larger than personal achievement. Sarah saw the military as an opportunity to apply her emergency response training on a larger scale while serving her country in a way that utilized her unique combination of analytical thinking and practical problem-solving abilities. Marine Corps' training had been both more challenging and more rewarding than she had anticipated. Her small size, which had been an advantage in civilian emergency response, became a source of constant commentary and occasional ridicule from drill instructors and fellow recruits who equated physical presence with military capability. But Sarah had learned to use skepticism as motivation, proving herself through performance rather than trying to change minds through argument or explanation. The assignment to Firebase Delta had been requested specifically because of her specialized training in confined space rescue and her ability to work effectively in high-stress environments. Her official duties included logistics coordination and communication support, but her personnel file also noted her availability for specialized emergency response when conventional approaches proved inadequate. It was exactly the kind of role she had trained for, combining her analytical skills with her practical experience in situations where lives depended on finding solutions that others had missed. Now, as she watched Morrison's team disappear into the burning building, Sarah felt the familiar calm that came when training and instinct aligned with urgent necessity. The trapped Marines in Sector 7 faced the same kind of life-threatening emergency that had shaped her understanding of what was possible when conventional approaches failed. Her mind was already working through the building's layout, calculating angles and distances while considering options that others had dismissed as too dangerous or impractical. The radio crackled with Morrison's first report from inside the building, his voice distorted by smoke and interference, but carrying the confidence of someone following a well-rehearsed plan. Sarah listened while continuing her work at the medical station, knowing that his confidence would last only until he encountered the obstacles that had stopped the previous rescue teams. When that moment came, she would be ready with alternatives that others hadn't considered, solutions that required someone small enough to go where larger rescuers couldn't follow. Morrison's voice crackled through the radio with the strain of someone pushing against immovable obstacles. "Command, we've reached the first checkpoint, but the corridor damage is worse than anticipated. The floor is buckling under our weight, and we can see daylight through cracks in the ceiling above us." Static punctuation punctuated his transmission, the interference growing heavier as electrical systems throughout the building continued to fail under the assault of heat and smoke. Colonel Peterson stood rigid beside the command vehicle, His jaw clenched as he listened to reports that confirmed his worst fears. The rescue attempt was following the same pattern as the previous efforts. Initial progress followed by insurmountable obstacles that forced withdrawal before any real progress could be made toward the trapped Marines. His experience told him to call off the operation before more lives were put at risk, but his conscience demanded that every possible option be exhausted before abandoning the 3 men in Sector 7. Understood, Morrison. Proceed with caution and report any changes in structural stability, Peterson responded, his voice maintaining the calm authority that command required even when the situation was deteriorating rapidly. Around the command post, officers and technical specialists monitored multiple data streams from thermal imaging cameras, structural sensors, and communication systems, all painting the same grim picture of a building that was coming apart faster than rescue efforts could progress. Sarah moved quietly among the medical equipment, organizing supplies while keeping her attention focused on the radio communications that revealed the true scope of the challenge facing the rescue teams. Dr. Huang had begun preparing for the possibility of additional casualties, her efficient movements betraying none of the tension that filled her voice when she spoke to her assistant about the growing likelihood that Morrison's team would join the earlier victims of failed rescue attempts. The radio erupted with sudden urgency as Morrison's calm professionalism gave way to alarm. Command, we've got a major structural failure in the East Corridor. The ceiling just came down between us and our exit route. We're trapped in here with the same people we came to rescue. The transmission was broken by sounds of falling debris and shouted warnings as the rescue team found themselves facing the same deadly situation as the Marines they had been trying to save. Silence fell over the command post like a physical weight. Peterson closed his eyes for a moment, the mathematics of the crisis shifting from 3 trapped Marines to 7 trapped personnel with oxygen supplies that were already running low. The rescue had become a disaster that multiplied the original problem while eliminating the resources that might have solved it. Every face around the command vehicle reflected the same calculation they were now looking at. Potential casualties that could reach double digits. Sir, came the voice of Lieutenant Hayes, the communications officer whose responsibility it was to maintain contact with the trapped personnel. Morrison's team estimates 30 minutes of air remaining. The original 3 Marines are down to maybe 15 minutes based on their last coherent transmission. The numbers were delivered with military precision, but everyone present understood that they were listening to a countdown toward multiple deaths. The structural engineers huddled around their monitoring equipment, their expressions growing more grave with each reading they recorded. The building's support systems were failing in cascade fashion, with each collapse triggering additional stress on remaining structures. Dr. Elizabeth Foster, the chief structural analyst, looked up from her instruments with the expression of someone delivering a death sentence. Colonel, I have to recommend against any further rescue attempts, she said, her voice carrying the weight of professional responsibility that overrode personal emotion. The building is experiencing systematic structural failure. Any additional weight or vibration could trigger a complete collapse that would kill everyone inside, along with anyone else who might be in the vicinity. Her words were technically accurate and professionally necessary, but they felt like abandonment to everyone who heard them. Peterson nodded grimly, understanding the logic while hating the conclusion it demanded. All personnel are to maintain a safe distance from the building. No one else goes inside for any reason. The order was tactically sound and personally devastating, the kind of command decision that would haunt him regardless of its correctness. 7 Marines were about to die while their brothers watched helplessly from outside. That it was then that Sarah stepped forward from her position near the medical station, her movements so quiet that several people didn't notice her approach until she spoke. Colonel Peterson, there may be another option. Her voice was steady but respectful, carrying none of the desperate urgency that might have made her suggestion seem like panic rather than analysis. Peterson turned toward her, his expression shifting from command authority to puzzled recognition. As he tried to place the small figure who had just interrupted a crisis briefing, "Private Chun, isn't it? You're assigned to logistics support." His tone wasn't dismissive, but it carried the weight of someone who had more pressing concerns than personnel assignments at the moment. "Yes, sir. But I'm also cross-trained in confined space rescue and structural emergency response," Sarah replied, her words carrying more weight than her appearance suggested. "I've been studying the building schematics, and there's a maintenance access system that bypasses the damaged areas entirely." She gestured toward the blueprints spread across the command vehicle's hood, her finger tracing routes that others had overlooked. Dr. Foster looked up from her instruments with professional skepticism. "Private, those maintenance passages were designed for building systems, not human access. They're barely large enough for repair work, and they certainly weren't built to handle the stress of a rescue operation." Her objection was technically sound, based on standard assumptions about what constituted viable rescue routes. "That's exactly why they might work," Sarah responded, her voice gaining confidence as she outlined her analysis. "The maintenance level is structurally independent from the main building framework. It's supported by the foundation and exterior walls, not by the internal supports that are failing. Someone small enough to navigate the passages could reach the trapped personnel without adding stress to the compromised structure." Sergeant Martinez, who had been listening from the edge of the group, stepped forward with barely concealed incredulity. "Chun, those passages you're talking about are maybe 3 feet high and probably filled with smoke and debris. Even if someone could fit through them, they'd need breathing apparatus, communication equipment, and enough gear to actually help 7 trapped Marines. You're talking about a suicide mission disguised as a rescue plan. The maintenance level has its own ventilation system, separate from the main building," Sarah replied calmly, her technical knowledge giving weight to her arguments. "Thermal imaging confirms that area is still relatively clear. As for equipment, I wouldn't need the heavy gear that's been slowing down the other rescue teams. My size is an advantage, not a limitation, for this type of operation." Colonel Peterson studied the young Marine who was volunteering for what everyone else considered an impossible mission. Her analysis was logical, and her knowledge of building systems was surprisingly comprehensive, but the idea of sending a soldier who looked barely old enough for high school into a collapsing building challenged every protective instinct he possessed as a commander. "Private Chun, I appreciate your willingness to volunteer, but the risks are unacceptable. You're not trained for this type of operation." "Actually, sir, I am." Sarah's response was quiet but firm, carrying the weight of experience that her appearance didn't suggest. "I've been certified in confined space rescue for 7 years, and I've performed similar operations in civilian emergency response. This is exactly the type of situation I was trained to handle." She paused, letting her credentials sink in before continuing. "The trapped Marines are running out of time, and conventional rescue approaches have failed. Sometimes you need an unconventional solution." Dr. Wang stepped forward from the medical station, her expression thoughtful as she considered Sarah's proposal from a medical perspective. "How would you establish communication with the trapped personnel? And what's your plan for actually evacuating 7 people through passages designed for maintenance access?" Her questions were practical rather than dismissive, seeking to understand the operational details rather than simply rejecting the proposal. Sarah had clearly thought through the logistical challenges. "I can carry portable communication equipment and oxygen supplies through the maintenance system. Once I reach the trapped personnel, I can guide them through smoke evacuation procedures while coordinating with rescue teams positioned at accessible exit points. The maintenance passages connect to multiple egress routes that bypass the damaged areas entirely. The conversation was drawing attention from across the emergency staging area as word spread that someone was proposing an alternative to abandoning the trapped Marines. Personnel who had been focused on their individual responsibilities began gathering around the command post, creating an audience for what was becoming a public debate about acceptable risk and unconventional solutions. The pressure of being watched added weight to every word spoken, making the discussion about more than just tactical decisions. Lieutenant Hayes looked up from his communication equipment with an expression of growing desperation. "Sir," Morrison's team just reported that their air supplies are running lower than expected. The physical exertion of trying to clear debris is consuming oxygen faster than anticipated. We're looking at maybe 20 minutes before the first casualties from oxygen deprivation. The time pressure transformed the theoretical debate into an immediate crisis that demanded decision rather than discussion. Peterson felt the weight of command pressing down on him as he considered options that ranged from unacceptable to impossible. The logical choice was to accept the casualties and prevent additional losses, but military tradition demanded that no one be left behind when any possibility of rescue remained. "Private Chun," Peterson said finally, his voice carrying the gravity of command responsibility. "Walk me through your plan step by step. I want to understand exactly what you're proposing and how you plan to accomplish it without becoming another casualty that we can't afford." His tone was serious but not dismissive, acknowledging that desperate situations sometimes required desperate measures. Sarah approached the blueprints with the confidence of someone who had studied the building's layout extensively during the long emergency response. Her finger traced routes through the maintenance system while she explained her analysis in technical terms that demonstrated knowledge far beyond what her apparent age and rank suggested. The gathered personnel listened with growing attention as she outlined a plan that was both audacious and technically sound. "The maintenance access begins here, at the utility building 50 meters from the main structure," she began, pointing to a small structure that most people had dismissed as insignificant. "The passages run underground, connecting to the main building's foundation level. From there, I can navigate through the mechanical spaces to reach Sector 7 without entering any of the areas that have suffered structural damage." Dr. Foster studied the blueprints with renewed interest, her engineering expertise allowing her to follow Sarah's analysis and evaluate its technical merit. "The structural separation you're describing is real," she admitted reluctantly. "But the physical challenges of navigating those spaces while carrying rescue equipment are enormous. Even someone your size would be pushing the limits of what's physically possible." "I've done similar operations before," Sarah replied simply, her voice carrying the quiet confidence of proven experience. "In civilian emergency response, confined space rescue is a specialty that requires specific training and physical capabilities. Size and agility are more important than raw strength when you're working in spaces that weren't designed for human access." The radio crackled with another transmission from Morrison's team, their voices now carrying the strain of oxygen deprivation and rising carbon dioxide levels. "Command, we're having difficulty maintaining consciousness. Need immediate assistance or we're going to lose people in here." The words were slurred and broken, painting an audio picture of 7 Marines slowly suffocating while their comrades watched helplessly from outside. Peterson closed his eyes, feeling the weight of command responsibility crushing down on him like physical pressure. When he opened them, his gaze fixed on Sarah with the expression of someone making a decision that would define his career and his conscience for the rest of his life. "Private Chun, if I authorize this operation, what do you need from us to give you the best chance of success?" The question sent a ripple of reaction through the gathered personnel, some nodding approval while others looked skeptical or concerned. Sarah's proposal was shifting from theoretical discussion to operational planning, crossing the line from desperate idea to actual rescue attempt. The stakes were no longer just the lives of 7 trapped Marines, but also the life of the young. Woman who is volunteering to risk everything in an attempt to save them. Lightweight breathing apparatus, portable communication equipment, and emergency medical supplies, Sarah replied without hesitation, her preparedness suggesting that she had been planning this operation while others debated alternatives. I'll also need coordination with Dr. Wang for evacuation medical support and tactical positioning of rescue teams at the exit points I'll be guiding people toward. The transformation from debate to operational planning happened with military efficiency, as personnel who had been skeptical of Sarah's proposal began focusing on the practical requirements for making it work. Equipment specialists pulled lightweight gear from storage while communication technicians tested portable radios for functionality in the harsh conditions she would be facing. The emergency response was shifting into a new phase, one that would be defined by the courage and competence of the smallest person on the base. The utility building squatted beside the main compound like an afterthought, its concrete walls stained with years of desert dust and mechanical wear. Sarah knelt beside the maintenance access hatch, her breathing apparatus tested and secured, portable communication equipment clipped to her belt alongside emergency medical supplies that had been stripped down to essential items only. The lightweight gear felt alien compared to the heavy equipment that other rescue teams had carried, but her experience had taught her that survival in confined spaces depended on mobility rather than overwhelming preparation. Colonel Peterson stood 10 feet away, his expression torn between command authority and paternal concern as he watched the smallest Marine on his base prepare for a mission that seasoned rescue veterans had declared impossible. Private Chun, you understand that once you enter those passages, we have limited ability to provide support if something goes wrong. You'll be entirely dependent on your own resources and judgment. His words carried the weight of someone giving final authorization for an operation that violated every conventional safety protocol. Understood, sir, Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to attempt. I'll maintain regular communication and abort the mission if conditions become unsafe. The promise was professionally necessary but personally meaningless. They all knew that once she committed to the underground passages, retreat might be impossible regardless of changing circumstances. Dr. Wang checked Sarah's medical supplies one final time, her movements efficient but betraying the tension of someone who understood the physical demands that lay ahead. You've got enough emergency oxygen for 30 minutes of supplemental breathing, assuming normal exertion levels. Pain medication and basic trauma supplies are in the medical kit, but remember that you're not equipped for serious injuries. Your job is to get them to evacuation points where we can provide proper treatment. The radio crackled with another transmission from Morrison's team, their voices now noticeably weaker as oxygen deprivation began affecting their cognitive function. Command, we're having trouble staying focused. Need to conserve energy and oxygen. We'll try to stay conscious until help arrives. The words were slurred and broken, painting an audio picture of 7 Marines slowly losing their battle against suffocation while time ran out with mathematical precision. Sarah tested her communication equipment one final time, her voice clear and professional as she spoke into the headset that would be her only link to the outside world during the underground journey. Communication check. How do you read? The response came back immediately from Lieutenant Hayes at the command post, confirming that radio contact would remain viable even through the concrete and steel that separated the maintenance passages. From the surface, the access hatch opened with a metallic screech that seemed unnaturally loud in the tense silence that had fallen over the staging area. Below the opening, darkness stretched downward into passages that were barely visible even with the powerful flashlight that Sarah carried. The maintenance tunnels were exactly as advertised, narrow, cramped, and designed for building systems, rather than human passage. Even someone her size would have to crawl through most of the route. dragging equipment behind her while navigating by memory and technical knowledge. Rather than clear sight lines, Sarah lowered herself through the hatch. With practiced efficiency, her movements economical and deliberate as she transitioned from surface operations to underground navigation. The descent felt familiar despite the dangerous circumstances, reminiscent of training exercises that had prepared her for exactly this type of emergency. Her flashlight beam revealed a concrete tunnel that stretched ahead into darkness, lined with pipes and electrical conduits that formed a mechanical highway beneath the burning building above. "Entering main passage now," she reported through her headset, her voice carrying clearly despite the confined space that surrounded her. "Visibility is good, and the air quality is better than expected. Beginning navigation towards Sector 7. The technical update provided reassurance to those monitoring her progress, while establishing a baseline for measuring any deterioration. In conditions as she moved deeper into the underground system, the navigation became an exercise in three-dimensional thinking, translating the two-dimensional blueprints she had memorized into the reality of crawling through spaces that were barely large enough for her equipment. Pipe joints served as landmarks while electrical conduits provided directional guidance through tunnels that would have been disorienting even under normal circumstances. Sarah's engineering background proved invaluable as she read the buildings. Mechanical systems like a roadmap, following the logic of structural design through passages that others would have found impossible to navigate. Progress was steady but physically demanding, requiring a combination of crawling, sliding, and occasionally contorting through spaces where building systems left minimal clearance for human passage. The weight of her equipment created additional challenges, forcing her to push gear ahead of her through tight sections while maintaining the careful balance necessary to avoid damaging essential communication and medical supplies. Each meter gained towards Sector 7 required conscious effort and systematic problem-solving as she encountered obstacles that had never appeared on any blueprint. "Halfway point reached," she reported, pausing to check her equipment and assess her physical condition. "All systems are functioning normally, and I'm maintaining good progress toward the target area." The update masked the reality of sweat-soaked clothing and muscles that were beginning to protest the unusual demands of underground navigation, but her voice remained steady as she prepared for the most challenging section of the journey. The maintenance passages near Sector 7 revealed evidence of the damage that had trapped Morrison's team and the original 3 Marines. Concrete dust coated every surface while the sound of settling debris filtered down from the main building above. Sarah's flashlight revealed cracks in tunnel walls that spoke of structural stress, transferred from the catastrophic failures occurring in the floors above her position. The underground route remained passable, but the visual evidence of ongoing collapse added urgency to her mission while confirming that conventional rescue approaches would have been suicide. "Approaching target area," Sarah transmitted, her voice now carrying the controlled excitement of someone who had successfully navigated the most difficult portion of a dangerous operation. "I can hear voices from above. Beginning search for vertical access to Sector 7. The sound of human conversation filtered through gaps in the ceiling above her, proof that the trapped Marines were still conscious and potentially capable of participating in their own rescue. The vertical access point proved to be a utility shaft that connected the maintenance level to the main building's mechanical systems. Sarah studied the shaft with her flashlight, calculating angles and clearances while considering the best approach for reaching the trapped personnel above. The climb would be technically challenging but well within her capabilities, requiring the same combination of strength and agility that had served her during previous confined space rescues. "I've located the access route to Sector 7, she reported, beginning the careful process of securing her equipment for the vertical ascent. "Beginning climb now. Estimate 5 minutes to reach the trapped personnel." The transmission carried confidence backed by technical competence, But everyone listening understood that the next few minutes would determine whether her unconventional rescue plan would succeed or simply add another casualty to the growing crisis. A utility shaft was a vertical maze of pipes and electrical conduits that provided handholds and footholds for someone with the right combination of size and skill. Sarah climbed with systematic precision, testing each grip before committing her weight while dragging essential equipment behind her through spaces that would have been impossible for larger rescuers to navigate. The physical demands were intense but manageable, well within the capabilities that years of training had developed for exactly this type of emergency. Above her, voices grew clearer as she approached the level where 7 Marines waited for help that conventional wisdom said could never arrive. The sound of labored breathing and occasional coughing painted an audio picture of oxygen deprivation that was approaching critical levels. But the fact that conversation was still possible meant that immediate rescue remained feasible if she could reach them quickly enough. "Almost there," Sarah transmitted, her voice steady despite the physical exertion of the vertical climb. "I can hear clear conversation from the trapped personnel. They're conscious and responsive." The update brought visible relief to faces. Around the command post, where Colonel Peterson and his staff had been monitoring her progress with the intensity of people whose careers and conscience depended on the success of an impossible mission. The final section of the climb brought Sarah to a maintenance access panel that connected the utility shaft to the main building's interior. Through gaps around the panel, she could see the dim emergency lighting that illuminated Sector 7, where 7 Marines had gathered in the only space that remained relatively clear of smoke and debris. Morrison's team had found the original 3 trapped Marines and combined their resources for mutual survival, creating a group that was too large for conventional rescue, but perfectly sized for the unconventional approach that Sarah was about to demonstrate. "I'm at the access point," she reported, beginning the careful process of removing the maintenance panel without triggering additional structural damage. "I can see all 7 personnel. They appear conscious and mobile, though showing signs of oxygen deprivation." Her assessment was clinically accurate, but carried the emotional weight of someone who understood that successful navigation to this point was only the beginning of a rescue operation that would test every skill she possessed. The maintenance panel came free with careful manipulation, revealing an opening that was barely large enough for Sarah's slight frame, but would never have accommodated the heavy rescue gear that previous teams had attempted to carry. She emerged into Sector 7 like an apparition, her small size and unexpected appearance creating a moment of stunned silence among Marines who had resigned themselves to waiting for death in a collapsing building. "I'm Private Sarah Chun," she announced calmly, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had successfully navigated impossible circumstances to reach them. "I'm here to get you out." The simple statement carried more weight than lengthy explanations. Backed by the evidence of her presence in a place where everyone had agreed no rescuer could possibly reach, Morrison looked at her with the expression of someone witnessing something that defied rational explanation. Where did you come from?" His question reflected the disbelief of a seasoned professional who understood the technical impossibility of what he was witnessing, but whose desperate circumstances made him willing to accept miracles without demanding detailed explanations. "Maintenance tunnels," Sarah replied efficiently, already beginning the process of distributing emergency oxygen supplies to the Marines who needed them most. "I need everyone to listen carefully while I explain the evacuation procedure. We're going to get out of here, but it's going to require following my instructions exactly." Her tone carried the quiet confidence of someone who had successfully completed the most difficult portion of an impossible mission and was now prepared to guide others through challenges they couldn't have imagined. The trapped Marines stared at the small figure who had appeared from nowhere to offer salvation when conventional rescue efforts had failed. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, whose rotation home had been delayed by circumstances beyond anyone's control, managed a weak smile as he accepted emergency oxygen from someone who looked young enough to be his daughter. "Ma'am, I don't know how you got here, but I've never been happier to see anyone in my entire life." Sarah's rescue plan unfolded with military precision as she guided 7 Marines through evacuation procedures that none of them had ever imagined. The route she had blazed through maintenance passages and utility shafts became their highway to safety, navigated under the guidance of someone whose unconventional capabilities had proven more valuable than all the heavy equipment and conventional training that had failed to reach them. Each step of the evacuation demonstrated why size and agility could triumph over brute force when the evacuation demonstrated why size and agility could triumph over brute force when the step of the evacuation demonstrated why size and agility could triumph over brute force. Situation demanded solutions that others had dismissed as impossible. The journey back through the underground passages became a masterclass in emergency leadership as Sarah coordinated the movement of 7 people through spaces designed for building maintenance rather than human passage. Her voice remained calm and professional throughout the evacuation, providing guidance and encouragement while managing the technical challenges of moving a group through confined spaces, where a single mistake could trap everyone involved. As the first of the rescued Marines emerged from the utility building into the harsh desert sunlight, cheers erupted from the staging area where personnel had been monitoring the radio communications with growing amazement. The impossible had become reality through the courage and competence of the smallest person on the base, proving that true strength came in forms that defied conventional expectations and challenged assumptions about what was possible when lives hung in the balance. The desert air hit the rescued Marines like a physical embrace as they emerged one by one from the utility building, their faces streaked with soot and their uniforms torn from the underground journey that had saved their lives. Corporal Johnson stumbled slightly as he reached the surface, his legs unsteady from oxygen deprivation and the unfamiliar physical demands of crawling through maintenance passages. But his eyes were bright with the relief of someone who had accepted death and then been granted an unexpected reprieve. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez was the last of the 7 to emerge, his experienced gaze immediately seeking out the small figure who had guided them through impossible circumstances. Sarah stood beside the utility building access hatch, her breathing apparatus hanging loose around her neck and her uniform, bearing the evidence of underground navigation that no training manual had ever described. Despite having just completed a rescue operation that defied conventional wisdom, she maintained the same quiet composure that had marked her presence throughout the emergency. The staging area erupted in controlled chaos as medical personnel rushed forward to assess the rescued Marines while firefighting teams worked to establish a secure perimeter around the evacuation site. Dr. Huang moved with practiced efficiency among the survivors, checking vital signs and administering oxygen while her trained eye evaluated each man for signs of serious injury or respiratory distress. The medical assessment was thorough but swift, designed to identify immediate threats while preparing for transportation to proper treatment facilities. Colonel Peterson approached the group with the measured stride of someone whose relief was tempered by the responsibility of command, his expression reflecting the complex emotions of an officer who had authorized an operation that violated every safety protocol in pursuit of an outcome that conventional wisdom declared impossible. His gaze fixed on Sarah with an intensity that spoke of someone reevaluating fundamental assumptions about capability and courage. "Private Chun," Peterson said, his voice carrying the formal tone that military protocol demanded, while his eyes reflected genuine amazement at what he had witnessed. "Your rescue operation was unprecedented. I've never seen anything like what you accomplished in there." The words were carefully chosen, reflecting both professional assessment and personal recognition that something extraordinary had just occurred under his command. Sarah straightened to attention with automatic precision, her posture reflecting military discipline, even as exhaustion from the underground operation began to show in the slight tremor of her hands. 7 Marines retrieved successfully, sir. No casualties during evacuation. All personnel conscious and responsive upon extraction. Her report was professionally formatted, reducing the heroic rescue to clinical facts that could be documented. In official records. Captain Morrison stepped forward from the medical treatment area, his movements still unsteady, but his voice carrying the authority of someone whose professional expertise had been dramatically expanded by recent experience. Colonel, with respect, Private Chun didn't just accomplish an unprecedented rescue. She accomplished something that every expert on this base declared impossible. Her analysis of the building structure was perfect, her navigation was flawless, and her leadership during the evacuation was textbook professional. The gathering crowd of personnel began to shift as word spread throughout the staging area that the impossible rescue had been completed successfully. Marines who had dismissed Sarah's proposal as a spread fantasy now watched her with expressions that reflected fundamental reassessment of their assumptions about size, capability, and courage. The whispered conversations that rippled through the crowd carried tones of amazement rather than skepticism. Dr. Foster approached from her position near the structural monitoring equipment, her expression reflecting the intellectual honesty of someone whose professional assessment had been proven dramatically wrong by subsequent events. Private Chun, your structural analysis was more accurate than our engineering models. The maintenance system integrity held exactly as you predicted, while our calculations about the main building proved overly optimistic. Where did you develop that level of expertise in building systems analysis? Cross-training in structural emergency response, ma'am, Sarah replied, her answer technically accurate while avoiding the detailed explanation that would have revealed the full scope of her civilian emergency response background. I've worked with similar building systems during previous emergency operations. The modest response understated expertise that had proven more valuable than advanced degrees and expensive monitoring equipment. Lieutenant Hayes looked up from his communication station with the expression of someone whose respect had been earned through demonstrated competence rather than assigned by rank or regulation. Private Chun, your radio discipline during the underground operation was exceptional. Clear reports, accurate assessments, and perfect timing on all communications. That's professional-level emergency response coordination. His praise carried weight because it came from someone whose job required evaluating communication performance under stress. The medical assessment revealed what Dr. Wang had hoped to find: 7 Marines who were suffering from smoke inhalation and mild oxygen deprivation, but had avoided serious injury thanks to the speed and efficiency of Sarah's unconventional rescue approach. The underground evacuation had protected them from the additional structural collapses that continued to shake the main building, while the maintenance passage route had minimized their exposure to toxic smoke and extreme heat. All 7 personnel are stable and responsive, Dr. Wang announced to Colonel Peterson, her medical assessment carrying the relief of someone who had prepared for much worse outcomes. They'll need observation for respiratory effects and treatment for minor injuries, but none of them require critical care. The evacuation was completed before any of them reached dangerous levels of carbon monoxide exposure or oxygen deprivation. The contrast between the successful rescue and the continuing disaster in the main building became increasingly apparent as secondary explosions continued to rock the structure that Sarah had bypassed entirely. Chunks of concrete and twisted metal showered down from upper floors while flames consumed everything that remained combustible, creating a hellish backdrop that emphasized the narrow margin by which 7 lives had been saved through unconventional thinking and exceptional execution. Sergeant Martinez approached Sarah with the hesitant manner of someone whose previous dismissiveness had been proven embarrassingly wrong by subsequent events. Private Chun, I owe you an apology. When you first proposed using the maintenance system, I thought it was. He paused, searching for words that would acknowledge his error without undermining his own professional credibility. I thought it was too dangerous to consider. I was wrong about the danger, and I was wrong about your capabilities. No apology necessary, Sergeant, Sarah replied, her tone carrying no trace of triumph or vindication despite having proven herself beyond any possible doubt. The conventional approaches were logical based on standard assumptions. Sometimes you need someone with different training to see alternatives that others miss. Her gracious response reflected maturity that went beyond her apparent years, focusing on professional cooperation rather than personal vindication. Private Miller, whose earlier skepticism about Sarah's physical capabilities had been voiced with the casual cruelty of youth, now watched her with the expression of someone whose worldview had been fundamentally challenged by witnessed reality. "Ma'am, how did you know the maintenance passages would hold up when the main building was collapsing?" That level of structural analysis seems like something that would require years of specialized training. Sarah's answer reflected the systematic thinking that had guided her analysis throughout the emergency. Building codes require maintenance systems to be structurally independent from main frameworks precisely so they remain accessible during emergencies. The maintenance level was supported by foundation and exterior walls, not by the internal supports that were failing. It was basic structural engineering, applied to emergency rescue requirements. The explanation made the rescue seem logical. In retrospect, but everyone present understood that recognizing the opportunity had required knowledge and insight that none of them possessed. Sarah's capability went beyond size and agility to encompass technical expertise that had proven more valuable than conventional emergency response training when circumstances demanded unconventional solutions. Colonel Peterson gestured toward the command vehicle, his expression indicating that the immediate crisis was shifting into the administrative phase that would follow any significant emergency operation. "Private Chun, I'll need a detailed after-action report on your rescue operation. The techniques you employed and the route analysis you conducted need to be documented for future emergency response training." His words carried the weight of someone recognizing that valuable lessons had been learned through dangerous circumstances. The request for documentation reflected more than bureaucratic requirements. It represented official recognition that Sarah's unconventional approach had established new standards for what was possible when traditional methods failed. Her rescue operation would become a case study in emergency response training, proof that innovative thinking could triumph over seemingly impossible circumstances when backed by proper preparation and flawless execution. Dr. Wong finished her medical assessments and approached Sarah with the expression of someone whose professional opinion had been shaped by observed competence rather than assumed limitations. "Private Chun, your field medical support during the evacuation was excellent. You managed 7 people through a physically demanding rescue operation without compromising anyone's medical condition. That requires both technical knowledge and leadership skills that go well beyond basic first aid training." The praise reflected recognition that Sarah's rescue had succeeded, not just because of her physical capabilities or technical knowledge, but because of her ability to coordinate complex operations under extreme pressure while maintaining the calm leadership that kept everyone focused on successful completion of seemingly impossible tasks. Her performance had demonstrated mastery across multiple specialties that were typically distributed among teams of experts. As the emergency response transitioned from active rescue to post-incident assessment, the transformed atmosphere around Sarah became increasingly apparent. Personnel who had previously dismissed her as insignificant now sought her input on technical questions, while officers who had barely noticed her presence began including her in conversations about emergency preparedness and response protocols. The change was subtle but unmistakable respect, earned through demonstrated capability rather than assigned by regulation or tradition. The 7 rescued Marines remained near the medical station, their recovery proceeding smoothly under Dr. Huang's supervision while they processed the reality of surviving circumstances that had seemed hopeless just hours earlier. Their conversations carried the mixture of relief and amazement that came from experiencing rescue through methods that none of them would have believed possible if they hadn't lived through them personally. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez approached Sarah as she completed her equipment inventory, his expression reflecting the complex emotions of someone whose life had been saved by someone he had initially dismissed as irrelevant to serious military operations. Private Chun, I don't know how to properly thank someone who pulled off what you just accomplished. You saved 7 lives using methods that none of us even knew existed. That's the kind of courage and competence that defines what it means to be a Marine. His words carried weight because they came from someone whose experience and rank gave him authority to recognize exceptional performance when he witnessed it. The acknowledgement represented more than personal gratitude. It was professional recognition from a seasoned Marine that Sarah's capabilities and courage had proven themselves beyond any possible doubt through the most demanding test that emergency circumstances could provide. The continuing collapse of the main building provided a constant reminder of what would have happened to the 7 trapped Marines if conventional rescue approaches had remained the only option considered. Each thunderous crash of falling debris emphasized the narrow margin by which lives had been saved through unconventional thinking and the courage to attempt something that experts had declared impossible. Sarah's quiet competence in the aftermath of her extraordinary rescue reflected the same characteristics that had marked her behavior throughout the emergency: professional focus, technical precision, and complete absence of ego or self-promotion, despite having accomplished something that would define her military career and establish her reputation as someone whose capabilities transcended conventional expectations about size, strength, and traditional approaches to impossible problems. 3 weeks after the rescue, Firebase Delta had settled into a rhythm that reflected subtle but profound changes in how the base operated and how its personnel understood the nature of capability and courage. The burned-out shell of the Eastern Wing stood as a stark reminder of the emergency that had tested everyone's assumptions about what was possible when conventional approaches failed, while the rebuilt sections incorporated design improvements that Sarah had suggested during the post-incident analysis. The morning briefing room buzzed with quiet conversations as officers gathered for the weekly operational review, their discussions ranging from routine logistics to tactical assessments of regional security threats. Colonel Peterson entered with his usual punctuality, but his gaze immediately sought out a figure that would have been invisible in this same room just months earlier. Private Sarah Chun sat near the back with a small group of specialists, her presence no longer overlooked but actively included in discussions that required technical expertise and innovative thinking. Ladies and gentlemen, today's briefing includes a presentation on emergency response protocol updates based on recent operational experience, Peterson announced, his words carrying the weight of lessons learned through circumstances that none of them would ever forget. Private Chun will be outlining the new confined space rescue procedures that have been developed from her successful operation during the Sector 7 emergency. The transformation in the room's atmosphere was immediate and unmistakable. Officers who had once dismissed Sarah as irrelevant to serious military operations now leaned forward with genuine attention, their notebooks open and pens ready to capture information from someone whose expertise had been proven under the most demanding circumstances possible. The respectful silence that greeted her approach to the podium reflected recognition earned through demonstrated competence rather than assigned by rank or regulation. Sarah's presentation was characteristically thorough and understated, focusing on technical procedures and safety protocols rather than the dramatic circumstances that had led to their development. Her analysis of building systems, route planning, and emergency coordination was delivered with the same quiet professionalism that had marked her performance during the actual rescue. emphasizing practical applications rather than personal heroics. The key insight is that emergency response requires matching personnel capabilities to operational requirements, rather than assuming that standard approaches will work in non-standard situations. She explained, her words accompanied by diagrams that illustrated the maintenance passage system she had navigated during the rescue. Size and agility can be strategic advantages when properly employed, just as strength and endurance are valuable in different circumstances. Major Patricia Williams, the base's new emergency response coordinator, took notes with the careful attention of someone whose job responsibilities had been shaped by recent events that challenged conventional wisdom about emergency preparedness. Private Chun, your analysis suggests that we should maintain specialized teams with different physical capabilities rather than assuming that one-size-fits-all approaches will handle all emergency scenarios. Is that correct? Exactly, ma'am, Sarah replied, her confidence reflecting expertise that had been tested under life-or-death circumstances. Emergency response is fundamentally about problem-solving under pressure. The best solutions often come from matching specific capabilities to specific challenges, rather than trying to force inappropriate tools to work in unsuitable situations. The briefing room's atmosphere reflected a transformation that went beyond emergency response procedures to encompass broader questions about how military organizations identified and utilized the full range of capabilities that their personnel possessed. Sarah's rescue had become a case study not just in technical innovation, but in the importance of recognizing valuable expertise, regardless of where it resided within traditional hierarchies. After the briefing, Sarah made her way to the reconstructed communication center where her official duties continued to focus on logistics coordination and technical support. The work itself hadn't changed dramatically, but her role within the broader base operations had expanded to include consultation on problems that required unconventional thinking or specialized technical knowledge. Her small desk was now positioned near the emergency response planning area, symbolic of her integration into operations that were considered essential to base security. Lieutenant Hayes looked up from his communication equipment as Sarah entered the center, his expression reflecting the comfortable professional relationship that had developed between them since the emergency. Chun, we've got a situation developing at Forward Operating Base Bravo. They're reporting communication equipment failures that are affecting their ability to coordinate with air support. Colonel Peterson wants your assessment of potential technical solutions. The request reflected how Sarah's role had evolved from simple task execution to problem analysis and solution development, her demonstrated competence during the rescue having established her credibility for handling complex technical challenges. She reviewed the communication reports with the same systematic approach that had guided her emergency response planning, identifying patterns and potential solutions that others had missed. The failure pattern suggests interference from improvised jamming equipment rather than mechanical breakdown, Sarah analyzed, her assessment based on technical knowledge that went beyond basic communication procedures. If that's correct, the solution isn't equipment replacement, but signal routing through alternative frequencies that bypass the jamming spectrum. Her analysis proved accurate when implemented, solving the communication problem through technical innovation rather than expensive equipment replacement. The success added to her growing reputation as someone whose problem-solving capabilities extended across multiple specialties, reinforcing the lessons learned during the rescue about the value of unconventional thinking when standard approaches failed to produce results. The afternoon brought a visit from Marcus Webb, the homeless veteran whose life Sarah had saved during the warehouse fire 7 years earlier. His presence at Firebase Delta reflected the continuing connections that linked her civilian emergency response background to her current military service, personal relationships that had shaped her understanding of what it meant to use specialized skills in service of something larger than personal achievement. You've built something impressive here, Sarah, Marcus observed as they walked through the base's operational areas, his trained eye recognizing the subtle changes in how personnel interacted and how problems were approached. The rescue operation you pulled off has changed how people think about capability and leadership. That's the kind of impact that extends far beyond the immediate circumstances. His perspective carried weight because it came from someone who had witnessed Sarah's development from teenage volunteer to accomplished emergency responder, understanding better than most how the skills demonstrated during the recent rescue had been developed through years of training and experience that prepared her for exactly the kind of challenge that Firebase Delta had presented. "The real change isn't in how they see me," Sarah replied, her observation reflecting characteristic focus on broader implications rather than personal recognition. "It's in how they approach problems that don't fit standard solutions. The rescue succeeded because we were willing to consider alternatives that conventional wisdom said were impossible." That kind of thinking applies to much more than emergency response. Their conversation was interrupted by an announcement over the base's communication system, Colonel Peterson's voice carrying the gravity that marked significant operational developments. "All personnel, we have received official confirmation that the enemy attack on Firebase Delta has been designated as a strategic probe designed to test our emergency response capabilities. Intelligence analysis indicates that our unconventional rescue operation has been noted by hostile forces as evidence of enhanced defensive capabilities." The announcement reflected a dimension of Sarah's rescue that went beyond the immediate saving of 7 lives to encompass broader questions of military effectiveness and strategic deterrence. Her successful operation had demonstrated that Firebase Delta possessed capabilities that enemy planners hadn't anticipated, potentially affecting their calculations about the feasibility of future attacks against similar installations. Dr. Wang approached their group from the medical facility, her expression carrying the satisfaction of someone whose professional assessments had been validated by positive outcomes. "Private Chun, the follow-up medical examinations on the rescued Marines show no long-term effects from their smoke exposure or the underground evacuation. Your medical support during the rescue operation was exactly what they needed to avoid. Serious respiratory damage." The medical confirmation added another layer to Sarah's demonstrated competence, proving that her rescue had succeeded not just in immediate terms, but in protecting the long-term health of the people she had saved. The success reinforced her reputation as someone whose technical knowledge extended across multiple specialties, making her valuable for operations that required coordination between different areas of expertise. As evening approached, Sarah found herself back at the memorial wall where the names of fallen Marines were inscribed in black granite that reflected the desert sunset. The wall had gained no new names during the recent emergency, a fact that carried profound meaning for everyone who understood how close they had come to losing 7 good Marines to circumstances that seemed beyond anyone's ability to control. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez joined her at the memorial, his presence reflecting the continuing bond between someone whose life had been saved and the person who had risked everything to save it. "Chun, I've been thinking about what you said during the evacuation, about focusing on solutions rather than obstacles. That's a lesson that applies to more than emergency response. It's about how we approach every challenge we face." His words reflected the broader impact of Sarah's rescue operation, which had become a teaching example about the importance of innovative thinking, careful preparation, and the courage to attempt solutions that others dismissed as impossible. The rescue had demonstrated that true strength came in many forms, and that the most valuable capabilities were often found in unexpected places. The conversation expanded as other Marines joined them at the memorial, their informal gathering becoming a discussion about leadership, capability, and the importance of recognizing expertise wherever it existed within military organizations. Sarah's presence at the center of these conversations reflected her transformation from overlooked support personnel to recognized expert, whose insights were valued across multiple areas of base operations. "The thing that still amazes me," observed Corporal Johnson, whose wife had given birth to their first child just days after his rescue, "is how you saw possibilities that none of us even considered. It wasn't just about being small enough to fit through those passages. It was about understanding building systems, planning evacuation routes, and keeping everyone calm during the most stressful situation any of us had ever experienced." His observation captured the essence of what made Sarah's rescue operation so remarkable, not just the physical courage required to attempt something so dangerous, but the intellectual competence needed to plan and execute a complex operation under circumstances where failure would have meant additional deaths rather than simply unsuccessful results. Her success had required the integration of multiple specialized skills with leadership capabilities that emerged naturally under pressure. As the group dispersed, and Sarah prepared to return to her quarters, Colonel Peterson approached with the measured stride of someone whose respect had been earned through witnessed competence rather than assigned by regulation. "Private Chun, I've received authorization to recommend you for promotion to corporal, with assignment to the base's new emergency response specialist position. Your demonstrated capabilities during the rescue operation have established the need for someone with your particular combination of skills." The promotion offer reflected official recognition of Sarah's value to military operations, but her response was characteristically focused on mission effectiveness rather than personal advancement. "Thank you, sir. I'd like to continue developing emergency response capabilities for the entire base rather than just individual recognition. The rescue succeeded because we were willing to try unconventional approaches when conventional methods failed. That kind of thinking should be institutionalized rather than dependent on individual expertise." Her response reflected the maturity and perspective that had guided her approach throughout the emergency, focusing on organizational improvement rather than personal achievement. The promotion would provide her with the authority and resources needed to develop the emergency response capabilities that could prevent future tragedies, but her real satisfaction came from knowing that valuable lessons had been learned and would be applied to protect others. The night sky over Firebase Delta was clear and brilliant, with stars that seemed close enough to touch in the desert air. Sarah stood on the observation deck of her quarters, looking out over a base that had been forever changed by events that proved the value of unconventional thinking and the courage to attempt solutions that others considered impossible. The burned-out sections were being rebuilt with improved designs, while new training programs incorporated lessons learned from her rescue operation. Her transformation from overlooked support personnel to recognized expert reflected broader truths about capability, leadership, and the importance of matching skills to challenges rather than assuming that standard approaches would always prove adequate. The rescue had succeeded because she possessed the right combination of knowledge, training, and courage for the specific circumstances that Firebase Delta had faced. But the deeper lesson was about the value of recognizing and utilizing the full range of capabilities that existed within any organization. The quiet satisfaction that filled her as she reviewed the day's events came not from personal recognition, but from knowing that 7 Marines were alive because someone had been willing to attempt something that conventional wisdom declared impossible. Her small stature, which had been the source of dismissive humor just weeks earlier, had proven to be exactly the capability that the situation required when size and agility mattered more than strength and conventional equipment. The story of Sarah's rescue would be told and retold throughout the Marine Corps, becoming part of the institutional memory that shaped how future emergencies were approached and how personnel capabilities were evaluated. But for Sarah herself, the most important outcome was the knowledge that when the moment of ultimate testing arrived, she had possessed the skills, courage, and determination necessary to save lives through methods that no one else had been able To imagine or execute. In the end, true strength had revealed itself not through physical power or conventional authority, but through the quiet competence of someone whose capabilities had been forged through years of training and tested under circumstances that demanded everything she had learned about emergency response, leadership, and the courage to attempt the impossible when lives hung in the balance. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.